Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the Ultimate Stepic tutorial course. We were so happy to see how much you guys enjoyed the first 6 videos that it inspired us to bring you guys a 7th video. Now, in this part of the course, we want to show you guys some really interesting and useful tips and tricks when using Stepic. Now, some of these tips you might not know, and you're going to find them really useful in your music production, and it just makes using Stepic much more fun. So, let's get started. Okay, so the first tip I want to share with you guys is how we can humanize Stepic. Now, when we use sequencers, they can oftentimes sound very quantized or very robotic, right, because they're exactly on the grid. And we tend to overcome this by humanizing the performance by slightly changing the timing of the notes. Now, in Stepic, this is really easy to do, and you're going to get some really cool results. So here we have a minor key and a cool little sequencer. Let's take a listen to this real quick. Now, this sequence is quantized exactly on the grid, so a really cool way to humanize this, if we go down here to the Swing tab, and let's bring this 16 all the way down to 1, so it's just one step here, and let's turn on the randomization, and now let's take a listen to see what we have. Okay, so the swing is working, but it's a little bit strong. So what we can do is we can navigate to our settings page, so our pattern settings right here at the top, and where it says this random swing range right here, it's max at 75. So let's bring this all the way down here, and then let's start slowly increasing this knob until we feel like we have something that we like. Okay, so I think a value of 20 sounds pretty good to me, right? It's not exactly on the grid. It's a little bit swingy, I suppose. So what we can do as well to kind of confirm that this is happening, we can go back to our sequencer page and let's bring this down a little bit here and let's export this MIDI and see exactly how this looks. So we can click and drag here to our timeline and let's take a look at this here. So let's double click this guy. And if we zoom in to see these notes, we notice they're not going to be exactly on the grid. They're going to be humanized, sounding a little bit more human. Okay, so now if we want to have a little bit more control over humanizing and bring a little bit of that rhythm back into the sequence, we can do a slightly different approach. So let's navigate back to our Swing tab, and in this case, we're actually going to use 2 sliders instead of 1. And the first one we're not going to touch, we're going to leave this one alone, but the second one we're going to randomize. So basically, the odd numbers of notes are going to be right on the grid, and the even ones, so starting on 2, are going to be a little bit more rhythmic, have a little bit more groove to them. So in this case, let's go to our Settings tab, and let's start to adjust this random swing range as we listen to our track. Now, this is a really good way to keep things in time, but also to give a little bit of swing, a little bit of that groove to move the track just a little bit better. And we can even use this same technique for a more rhythm-orientated sound, like a hi-hat, for example. So in this scenario, I have a hi-hat loaded up in Pigments, and Stepic is on a note length of 1/16, and I'm also using a divider here on step 16 on a value of 2, and this will make step 16 play the hi-hat 2 times during that step. And at the moment, we have no humanization applied. So we know that the hi-hats are in time, but it's kind of boring, right? So what we can do is spice this up by using 2 steps of swing like we just did. So we can bring this down from 16 all the way down to 2, and then we're going to randomize this second step here, and let's go adjust these settings here in our settings page while the track plays. What we could also do as well is this whole time we've been adjusting the max value. Here is going to be the minimum value right next to it. So on the second step, it does have a possibility of being right on the grid. And if that's something that we don't want, we can always increase this here maybe to a higher value. So this case right here, it's 12 on the minimum and 23 on the maximum. So this randomization will only apply in between this range. So that's pretty groovy there. So let's take a listen to this here in our track once the entire drum kit starts to come in. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the options we have available to us in the global settings by clicking on the gear icon on the top left of Stepic. Now at the top here, we have a zoom factor, which changes the size of Stepic, which we should all know by now. But what you may not know is that the option right below this here is called Global UI Scale Factor, and by default this is set to 100%, and this setting should be fine for most users. However, if you have a small display and need to scale Stepic to be smaller and fit your screen a little bit more comfortably, this option is going to be for you. And if we click this drop-down list here, we can go all the way down to 50. So let's go ahead and select that. Let's hit close and then let's hit OK. Let's close out Stepic and then let's reopen the window. And then now we have a tiny Stepic in case you have a small display. This is going to work much better for you. So another reason to use this feature is if your computer's display scaling is set higher than the default, which makes things easier to see what's going on the screen, but it can also cause some problems once we're starting to load Stepic. Since a computer screen's display scaling is so high, Stepic's window may not be entirely shown. So let me show you what I mean by increasing my display scaling in my operating system to 175%, and we're going to try to load Stepic. Now, if we're looking here in Bitwig, we can see how much the display scaling has enlarged our screen, which makes things easier to see. But now what happens if we start to load up Stepic and see what it looks like? We get this. So that's why the setting is so important. So we can go here to the gear, and first we can bring this down to maybe 75%. And for all intents and purposes, this could be fine for us, but it can also be too much because Stepic is pretty much taking up the entire screen. We'd have to move it around and look at our timeline, and that might not be a fun way to work. So if we go back to our global settings and then go to this menu, and then maybe we can go down to 50 or 60%, for example, hit close, hit OK, close out Stepic, and then we reopen it. This is going to be a little bit more comfortable to work with if we have our display like this. Okay, so next up, let's go over to our automation page and let's turn this first lane on. Now we can see that all of these are going to be sliders, right? Hopefully we're familiar with these by now. Now what we can also do is we can change these into knobs or into pots, right? So if we go up here to the global settings again, and then here it says automation value option. By default, this is going to be on faders. However, we can click this and then go down to pots and then select close. Now all of these are going to be pots. Now this looks really cool, but something to keep in mind is that when we're using these automation knobs or pots, we can no longer use this shift and change the values on the fly like we do with the sliders. However, it does look really cool. Okay, so the next tip is going to be up here in the global settings. Now on the right hand side, we see something called save pattern immediately, and this is going to be on yes by default. So basically, whenever we start to change an empty pattern, those changes are going to be automatically saved to that pattern, which is actually a very nice feature to have. But there's going to be times where you may not want that to be the case. So if we click this and we select no, we can freely adjust the pattern and try different things out and only commit those changes if we like them via the store button. Even if we adjust our pattern and then we try switching to a different pattern without saving, Stepic will ask us if we'd like to save those changes or not. Now, this can be useful if you've made lots of different changes to the pattern, but you end up not liking those changes, so you can select a different pattern and select no, so you haven't overwritten your pattern. So now we have save pattern immediately selected on no. Let's see how this would work in real time. Okay, so let's say I do these changes and I end up really not liking what I did here, because now it doesn't sound as good as the original. So all the changes haven't been lost. We don't have to do anything crazy like load in a different preset. All we can do now is select a different pattern, and then it says, do you want to save it? And we select no, and then we can go back to our first pattern and it's exactly how it was before. Definitely a really cool feature to have. In our global settings, we have an option called Use OpenGL Rendering. Now, this option is asking us if we want to render Stepic from the graphics card or from the CPU. Now, Stepic is already a very efficient plugin, but if you want to make it even more efficient, it's recommended to set this option to yes, which will render Stepic on the graphics card and not the CPU. As music production can be very heavy on the CPU depending on what you're using, it's nice to allocate things to the graphics card if we have the option to do so, but if you'd rather run it on your CPU and not the graphics card, make sure to select no. So as we saw in the Ultimate Stepic tutorial course, we can export our MIDI from Stepic to our timeline via the MIDI export button here. So if we drag and drop this here to our timeline, we can see that we have these notes exported, right? Pretty cool. But what you might not know is that we can actually export live MIDI playing. So for example, if we click this MIDI play, let's go from sync to host to note on, and then the note in mode, let's select arpeggiator. So now if we play a chord, we have an ARP. So what we can do is let's bring the swing note down up here, let's play a chord, and then let's export. Click down here and we can see that our ARP is actually exported. Now keep in mind that Stepic doesn't have a buffer, so this means that if we're doing different chord changes and then export that MIDI, only the chord that we were playing at the moment of export will actually be exported. So next up, we have transport mode in the global settings here, and by default, this is going to be set to sample rate. Now this option will use the sample rate of the session to calculate the transport speed, and in this scenario, the DAW will be the master clock. If you'd rather use an external clock, you'd want to set this one from sample rate to timecode and then select close. Okay, so next tip, if we navigate to the automation page and we turn on the first automation lane, we can right-click this yellow dice and get some really cool automation shapes. Now, what's even cooler than that is that these can actually be scaled. So if we reset all of these and brought down our length to around 8, for example, and then did the same thing, we still have the same shapes, but they're going to be scaled in 8 steps, or we can go even further to 11 steps and do the same thing, and they're going to be scaled now to 11 steps, and we can do interesting shapes like that. So next up, we have high contrast mode, and we can do that via F3. So it's going to make things a little bit brighter for us to see. Now, if you want to keep this on forever, just hit F3 and it's going to stay that way. However, if you just want to toggle it for a little bit and turn it back off, you can always hold down F2 for as long as you need, and then once you let it go, it's going to toggle right back off. So next up, we have the pattern octave offset. Now, as we know in Stepic, we can bring everything up by 2 octaves or bring everything down by 2 octaves. And I'm moving these all by right-clicking and holding these, right? Now, let's say we listen to our sequence as 0. And now let's bring it up by 2 octaves. So let's say now we want to bring this up by an additional octave, but we have no more room on the slider. What we can do is go down to the settings page, and then down here at the bottom where it says pattern octave offset, this is going to be 0 by default. We can click this here and add an additional octave here. So let's take a listen to that as we change this option. Now, this also works going down the octaves, right? So if we're down here in our sequencer and we bring everything down to -2, we can do the same thing. We can click this default and then go to -1, and it's going to bring everything down an additional octave. So when we're working with turning steps on or off or even connecting them, our left mouse button will cycle from on to con to off and then back to on. Our right mouse button will go on, off, on. Now there's actually a feature in the global settings that changes this behavior that I personally like a little bit more because I feel that I can work a little bit faster. Now up here in the global settings via this gear on the top left of Stepic, we see on the bottom right, step on, off mouse mode, cycle on, con, off, default, which is the one we just went through. Now the other option is left, on, off, and then right, con, off. So let's go take a look at that guy. So now our left mouse button is going to be on, off, and then our right mouse button is going to be con, off, con, off. Now it takes a little bit of getting used to, but I really like this version a little bit better. So next up, we have random global ranges. Now, for example, if we're here in our octaves and we do some randomizations like this, we can see that we're going to get -2 down here and then +2 right up here. Now let's say this is a huge range and we really only want -1 and +1. We could go to the settings and do that here, but that's only going to be for the pattern, right? If we want this globally for all the new instances of Stepic that we use and then empty patterns, then we need to go to this gear icon on the top here. And then right here where it says random octave range, we can change this from -2 to -1 and then +2 to +1. And then we hit close. And keep in mind that this is going to work for all these other ones down here. So random duration, random velocity, swing, divider, and note repeat. We can hit close. And then now let's close this guy out. Let's select this Stepic. We can actually delete it and then let's add a new one. And then now, once we're here on the octaves, we can start resetting these here or randomizing these, and we're never going to hit -2 or +2. So also in the global settings, we have something down here at the bottom that's called initial velocity value and then initial duration value. And here's where we're going to set the starting value for the velocity and the duration for all new instances of Stepic and empty patterns. Now, these are useful controls because depending on what you use with Stepic, we may not want the default velocity value. Maybe we want something a little gentler, like 50, for example. And the same goes for duration as well. Maybe Stepic's default 100 is a little too much and you want to lower it for every new instance. This is going to be where you'd want to do that. Okay, so at this point, we should be pretty familiar with changing the speed of Stepic via the note length menu up here on the top bar. And if we click this drop-down menu, we have lots of interesting timing choices to pick from, but down here at the bottom, we have something called custom. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting and also really fun. So in this mode, we can change both the nominator and the denominator anywhere from 1 to 99. And we do that by hovering our mouse over the number and then just scrolling up and down like that. So for this example, we're going to be on 4/1, and I have Stepic set up here on the transport mode as note on, and then the note in mode is going to be an arpeggiator. And really the only notes that I'm going to be using are a F sharp and a C sharp, so nothing too crazy in that sense. But the real fun starts to happen in the automation page. So I have 5 different things mapped here, and I'm using pigments. So the first one is going to be a noise oscillator's volume, just modulating that up and down via these sliders. The next one is a shimmer reverb, the dry wet of that, and then we have a macro 3 spread, which is basically just moving the sound across the stereo field. And then we have the filter 1 resonance, and then a flanger dry wet as well. So if we turn all of these off real quick, and the first one that we should really kind of look at to see how this starts to sound is just by itself with no modulation. So let's take a listen to that. So we kind of just have this tone that's just kind of doing its thing, right? And it starts to get interesting once we start adding these modulations. And the key thing here is the different timing. So for example, one of the most obvious ones really to check out is going to be this spread here. So let's turn this on. And we can see that this is a speed of 1/12, and it's going to be off for the first 2 steps and then on for the next 4 and so on and so forth. So let's take a listen to that. So we have this change going on, and then on top of that, we also are modulating the filter 1 resonance. So let's take a listen to that. So now it's starting to get a little more interesting, and this is moving at a vastly different time of 2/60. And then on top of that, here we have the noise oscillator. So let's turn this guy on and take a listen to that. And this is going 1/19. Now, these are the kind of main things that are going to be changing throughout this sound. And the next two, the reverb and the flanger, are kind of just icing on the cake, but we're also going to be modulating the dry and wet knobs for both of those. So the next one up is going to be this flanger. Let's take a listen to that guy. And this one's moving on a speed of 1/11. And then the last but not least is the reverb. And this one's a little bit more subtle, but it kind of ties everything in together. Let's take a listen to that. So we can catch that tail right there. Now, the real cool part is once we start putting this inside a track. So let's unsolo this guy here. Let's start from the beginning. And we have 2 bars of the sound kind of just setting the stage, getting a rhythm, getting a groove going. And then this is going to come in at bar 3. So let's take a listen to this as we start adjusting some values. Okay, so that sounds pretty cool, but let's see what happens once we start changing the timing of the notes themselves. So the trick is really to have your track playing and get your mouse wheel over these different note lengths, also in the automation page as well. And really just kind of scroll up and down to really feel the vibe of the track, because there's always going to be some sweet spot and you're going to really notice it at some point. So now that we understand how all that works, let's take a look at Pigments itself and start seeing how the modulation works in real time, also while we adjust a couple parameters inside the synth itself. Alright guys, that wraps up this video, and we truly hope that these tips and tricks were helpful to you and also inspire your creativity when using Stepic. Thank you so much for watching, hopefully you learned something, and we look forward to reading your comments and hearing your feedback.